Awesome. Yeah, this is a CPT, chess position trainer. Okay, so this is going to be part 3 of the opening forum. And this is going to be talking about the reverse dragon, which is a very popular setup for black. And then we'll look at some other second moves after 1e5. Okay, so we get to it via this move order, d5. Okay, so cd5, knight d5, knight f3. So notice if black plays e4 here, just drops a pawn to queen a4 check, and queen takes c4. So he has to defend this pawn. Knight c6, castle. Okay. So as you notice, this is, if white were playing the black pieces, this would be called a dragon. Okay, so here black has two main moves. He can either play knight b6, or he can play bishop e7. So the point of knight b6 is to take this knight out of to get this knight out of take from on d5, and also it helps black establish control of this d4 square because now his queen is looking at d4. Okay, so d3, bishop e7, and now the more normal move is to play knight c3 here, but I'm going to recommend playing this move knight bd2. So the idea is to put pressure on this e-pawn by playing some combination of a3 and b4, bishop b2, then playing rook c1, and oftentimes white will be able to effect an exchange sacrifice on c6, which ruins black's pawn structure and gives him great play. So let's see how this comes about. Yeah, so white's going for queenside play for sure. Okay, so castle. So let's look at if black tries to play aggressively with, say, bishop g4, a3, a5 to stop b4, b3, and now if black plays something like f5, bishop b2, bishop f6, and now white has this cute little resource, b4. So the point is we're simply threatening to play b5 and win this pawn, and if take, rook takes, queen takes, notice that now we're attacking e5. So if black takes on b4, we can take on e5. And now we're triple attacking e5. So if knight takes b4, for example, knight takes e5, and white is much better simply because he has these central pawns. Or sorry, not knight takes e5, bishop takes e5. Sorry, you don't want to hang e2. And again, white's better because of the central pawns. Okay, and now let's look at another risky idea, which is to play this move g5. So black's just basically trying to mate white. But it shouldn't work because black doesn't really have enough pieces developed and white's position is too safe. So b3, g4, knight e1, bishop e6. And now you could actually take on c6 here and then play bishop e2, but bishop e2 is fine as well. Knight d5, and now knight c4 threatening this e5 pawn again. f6, knight c2, queen d7, and now you play d4. And the point is this breaking up of the center will be beneficial to white because his pieces are better placed than black's. And this pawn on g4 just kind of looks silly. Okay, so that's a couple of crazier things that black can try. Okay, so castle. a3, so we're getting ready to play this b4 move. So again, the idea is to play b4, bishop b2, and pressure e5. Another idea is if black plays a5, we can play b3, knight c4, and then if black takes with the knight, we recapture with this b pawn and gain pressure on the b file. Okay, So here black plays a5. Okay, so for e8, for example, instead, b4, bishop f8, bishop e2, a5, b5, knight d4, take, a4, bishop b4, knight b3, and now this pawn on d4 is just lost. So white just wins a pawn for nothing. Okay, so instead, if a5, okay, now we can't play b4, but we can play b3. Bishop b6, bishop b2, f6, queen c2, queen d7, now to further our central break, we're going to play e3, d4. So e3, rook f8, and d4. And then after e4, we take with a knight. We don't want to give ourselves an isolated pawn. And now look at the pressure that white has on this position. White's hitting the c6 knight 3 times. Queen, bishop, and knight. And we also have played that c file. So after bishop d5, take, rook fd1, only white can be better here. Okay, Chi, what are you asking? Bishop a3? In which line? You're talking about this line? Oh, here? Bishop a3? No, knight b3 just wins the pawn. No need to play bishop a3. 15, knight takes d4. In which line? The main line? a3, a5, b3. This one? Oh. Yeah, so what if knight takes d4 here? Okay, right, so bishop takes d4. So now I'm hitting b7. And you can't play c6 because b6 hangs. So you have to play something like c5? Is that what you're asking, or? Yeah. I mean, this actually might be better than bishop d5 for black, but I mean, I'd say white is doing quite well. So if c5, for example, bishop takes c5 here, and then if rook a c8, then b4, you should be okay. What if bishop d5 in which line? Oh, so knight d4, bishop d4, and bishop d5, is that what you're asking? Here. Instead of c5. Well, here you just lose a pawn, I believe. I take on d5. Maybe. Yeah, you just take on d5, so you have to take with a knight, because if you take with the queen, I take on c7. Now I just play like rook ac, or maybe even rook f c1. And then my plan is to go like knight e4, knight c5. This should be good for white. If you ever play a move like b6, I have like queen c6. You can never really get c5 in. I have ideas of playing like queen to e4, and then doubling on the c file. So, I mean, it's playable. I just think it's preferable for white. Yeah. I mean, if you notice, black really has no targets. Like, if anything, maybe a3 is only a target, but white, you know, can always target b7, c7, even a5 in some lines if this rook goes away. Because really, black's pieces are concentrated on this d file that's blocked by this bishop, whereas white's pieces are concentrated on the c file, which black has no thing that's blocking it. So again, it's probably just more pleasant to play. Yeah. So I think taking is fine. I mean, you could also just play rook c1 immediately, maybe. Just rook f c1. And then, again, just threaten queen takes c7. Then, okay, if he takes, checks, you can just go king g1, or maybe even f3. Seems fine. But yeah, it's just more pleasant. Okay. So now let's look at the other main move for black, which is bishop e7. First, let me show you a couple of things that aren't so good. So for example, bishop e6 first, trying to do some sort of Yugoslav attack. Well, it's not going to quite work because we're up a tempo on the dragon, so he can play d4 immediately. And now, e takes d4. For example, queen d7 loses a piece to e4, with the idea of d5 to follow. So don't fall for that one. But okay, so e d4. Knight d4, knight d4, queen d4, knight b4, queen e4, hitting b7, and defending c2, and then c6, knight c3, bishop c5, a3, knight d5, knight d5, queen d5, queen d5, bishop d5, e d5, or c d5. Okay, and this should be very good for white, because this pawn on d5 is super weak. So again, white has all the chances. Just bring his rooks to c1 and d1, play king g2, king f3, pile up on that d pawn. And this should be a good ending for white. Okay, another thing that black can try that doesn't quite work is if he plays e4 here. Point is that now there's no queen a4 check. Okay, so here white has to play knight e1, but that's okay, because this pawn, it will be hard to hold. So bishop f5, for example, just simply d3. And if pawn takes, we have e4 right away. So all of a sudden, black's center is kind of crumbling. So here bishop c5 is also possible. Not too bad. But again, after a3, a5. So you want to try to get in b4. Okay, but now that black has stopped b4, now we can do this little fork trick, knight takes e5. So the point is, if knight takes e5, we have d4, forking these two pieces. So bishop takes f2, rook takes f2, knight takes e5. And white has two bishops here and two center pawns. So again, white should probably be better here. Okay, so let's go back to bishop e7. Okay, so d4. So the main move here is e takes d4. But let's look at quickly what happens on e4. So you have to move this knight. Now that we've played this move d4, our knight has gained an additional square, which we should put to good use with knight e5. And now this is actually somewhat awkward for black, because we're threatening knight takes c6, which doubles his pawns and gives us clear targets, and we're also threatening simply to take on e4, bishop takes e4. So if black tries something like knight takes e5, then we just recapture. Okay, bishop f5. How strong are those center pawns? Pretty strong. As long as you push them in unison, they should be good. Okay, so f5 here, by the way, just e takes f6, knight takes f6, and queen b3 is strong. So now castling is illegal, and white's just going to finish his development. So knight c3, rook d1, bishop f4, or g5, and not being able to castle is really going to hurt black. Not to mention he has this weak pawn on e4. Okay, so bishop f5 to defend the pawn. Then again, we have a little trick. We can take on e4 because we have this queen a4 at the end. So bishop b6 e4, queen a4 check, queen d7, queen takes e4, h5, knight c3, queenside castle. Oops, not king d8. Queenside castle. So black is just down a pawn that he's going to try to mate white. And of course, what happens when you're trying to mate somebody? Well, you go into an ending. So take, 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 take. And now no mating. And black has hardly any compensation for the pawn. As long as white can get this rook on a1 out, he should be winning. So maybe just like king f3, bishop e3, and a rook to d1. I noticed that the rook can never come to d2 because of this bishop. So okay, so the only tricky thing that black has in this position after knight e5 is to play f5. And so here, after knight takes c6, bishop b takes c6. Now the thing is, okay, these pawns are incredibly weak, but this pawn on e4 is actually quite strong. So it's a very dynamic position, but black should be okay-ish here. White should still be better, but not as much as in the other lines. So for example, knight c3, castle, queen a4, hitting the pawn, queen d6 defending it, knight takes, c takes, bishop f4, queen a6, queen c2, defending this pawn, c6, and rook fc1. And white's slightly better, but black can hold on to this pawn. He can play like bishop d7, and then eventually he'll try to play like rook c8 and c5 at some point. And this bishop being out of the game hurts white a little bit, so he'll probably try to play e3, bishop f1 himself. And white's slightly better. Is bishop f4 possible anywhere? In which line? This original one? I mean, there's no need to. We just want to win a pawn here, right? Then just go into an ending. Yeah, we don't want to play bishop f4 here because g5 just wins the pawn. So that's why we have to play f4. And then again, once you play f4, your bishop can't come to f4. So okay, so we'll go back to the main line now, which is d4, ed4. Okay, so knight takes d4, knight takes d4, queen takes d4, and here knight f6. Okay, so if knight b4, it looks kind of pretty because you're threatening the queen, you're threatening knight c2. But now white has this tricky queen takes g7. So this looks bad at first glance because, okay, after bishop f6, everything's hanging. But after queen h6, knight c2, knight c3. And actually, black's lost here. So for example, if knight takes a1, simply rook d1. And the queen is running very short in squares. So bishop d7, for example, knight d5 is just curtains. So let us go back to reality with knight f6. Okay, so we don't want to trade queens really so much here. So we play queen a4. Okay, so if c6, then just develop rook d1, gain of tempo, and then knight c3. And then this is slightly better for white. Okay, queen d7. And again, we don't want to trade queens, so queen b3. c6, knight c3, castle, e4. Notice that the queen is kind of hampering the bishop from completing its development. So again, we don't want to trade queens, keeping pieces out of g4. And here after bishop e6 and b3. Again, we're gonna keep denying the trade of queens. And white went on to win this game. A natural kingside expansion is going to happen. F4, F5 ideas. Our queen is actually well posted on this diagonal. And these pawns are going to start rolling. So again, white's better here. And notice that this d file doesn't really help black because he can't really do anything on it. Rook d3 doesn't do anything, and rook d2 is defended. Okay. So now let's take a look at another idea from this. We should play this move c6 first. This is known as a Curie system. So the idea is that black wants to build up a big center with d5. Makes sense. So rather than playing d5 and having this pawn exchange for it, this way, if black plays d5 and take, he'll recapture with the pawn and build a big center. So of course we cannot allow that. So white has to strike back in the center immediately, and so d4 is recommended. Okay, now black can try a lot of things. So first let's look at what happens if he takes. So queen takes. d5, take. And now black is basically willing to play with an isolated queen pawn here and recaptures with a pawn. So he's going to hope that he gets active pieces to compensate for the fact that this pawn is isolated. If he takes back with a knight, it's even slightly worse. Because knight f3, and then if he tries like knight b4 or something, queen takes check, king takes, knight a3 to stop knight c2, bishop b7, castle, bishop b6. And the problem is these endings aren't going to be good for black. Yeah. So you notice how black has some weaknesses on the queen side. And this bishop on g2 is a monster. And black's king is misplaced. And white's knights are doing quite well. So by playing this, black basically says, okay, I'll accept this isolated queen pawn. And now we're going to complete our development. Knight f3, knight c6, gaining a tempo by attacking the queen, and so we tuck it away on a4. Okay, so now black wants to finish his development and develop this guy on f8 so he can castle. So there are actually three choices. He can move his bishop. He can either play bishop e7, he can play bishop c5, or he can actually give a check on b4. So bishop e7, we'll just castle, he'll castle. Knight c3, bishop d7. So the problem for white is that his queen is a little bit misplaced, but white's banking on the fact that black has this isolated pawn on d5, and that his structure will compensate for any kind of tempo that will be lost by him having to move his queen. So in these types of positions, you always want to control the square in front of the pawn. So what move would control the square in front of the pawn? Bishop e3 controls d4. And notice that this knight has nowhere good it can go to. There's no good discoveries for this knight. We can only just move our queen back. So rook c8, rook a d1, finally knight a5, queen c2. Okay, and then queen b1, tucking the queen away. Now firmly blockading. Queen A1. Now we're on this diagonal. And now we just win a pawn after rook takes d5. Yeah, I know, Marius. Twitch is having problems. So sorry if you guys are trying to participate. Okay, so now let's look at bishop c5. Castle, castle. Okay, now the fact that black has played bishop to c5 means that we can play bishop g5 and pin this knight. And remember, this knight is one of the main defenders of this pawn. So h6, and we actually intend to capture. Knight c3 gains a tempo. Bishop e6, attack and defense, develops and defends d5. Okay, and now, typical maneuver, knight e1. So the idea is we want to play knight e1 to d3 to f4, and from f4 we hit d5. So we want to kind of train all our pieces on d5. And notice that this also opens up this bishop. So rook a d8, knight d3, bishop d4. We have to defend this knight. Okay, so bishop takes c3, we just take back with the rook. So black plays queen e5. And here, rather than playing rook takes c3, which would allow d4, white actually played b takes c3. And now, since white firmly controls his d4 square, he's still slightly better, because his d5 pawn is a bit easier to target than the c3 pawn. And he can always play this move c4 at an opportune time if he needs to, whereas black can never really play d4. But yeah, this position is probably fairly level. But again, I still think I'd slightly prefer white. Okay. So the other move is bishop e4 check, which is a bit odd. Because this bishop is kind of like black's good bishop, considering this pawn will be on d5 for quite a while. So he's kind of trading off his good bishop. So we oblige. Capture, capture. Castle, castle. Queen b6. And now we are willing to trade queens, because again, as we get closer to an endgame, this pawn will become more of a liability. So black says no. We defend our pawn. Rook fc1. Bishop b6. Now bishop f1. Part of the point of playing rook fc1 was to get this bishop on a more active diagonal. Queen b6. Okay, now black has no choice. We say okay. We'll do it. And then we need to control his d4 square, so here it comes. Rook fc8 and knight bd4. Yeah, and this is kind of like the prototypical isolated queen pawn endgame. So this is just better for white. And yeah, I mean, the knight on d2 is a little awkward, but notice that we're eventually going to go to d4 with it. So, I mean, it's no faster to get to d4 from c3 than it is from d2. You know, so knight d2, b3, d4. From c3 you can go like b5, d4, e2, d4, but it's really all the same thing. Okay. So now let's go to what happens on move 4 if instead of e takes d4, black plays something else. So let's look at bishop b4 check. Okay, again, we're going to do the same thing, bishop d2. Take, this time we're going to take with the queen, so we don't hang this pawn. And now d6. Knight c3, castle, e3. So notice that now that both sides have exchanged their dark squared bishops, both sides are putting their pawns on dark squares, which makes sense, because now these light squared bishops will be better, and there's no need to worry about your dark squared bishop being hemmed in. So knight bd7. And now I'll show you what happens, say, if queen e7. The same ideas are going to happen for white. So knight g2, knight a6, h3, rook e8, castle, bishop e6. And now the idea is, which I'll show you in a second, is g4. g4 and knight g3. And you'll see that this is actually what happens in the main line as well. d5 and queen d8, I mean, you're just not better there, unfortunately. It's not bad. It's probably just equal. I mean, black has no problems there. But no, I wouldn't say it's bad. But I think you kind of give up your opening advantage if you do that. Because notice that our pieces are kind of limited. Like, this bishop is kind of just biting on his pawn on c6. This knight doesn't really have any forward squares to hop to. And black's rook is well posted. So there's really nothing that white can crow about. Although his position is solid as well. Okay, so anyway, so knight b7. Okay, and now it's gonna kind of be the same thing. Knight g2, queen e7. Okay, and now it looks odd that we don't castle here. But we play h3. The idea is we want to play g4. So for example, if black plays a move like e4, we can play g4, g5. And we're also preparing to play like a knight g3 to f5. So we're basically playing h3 so we can play g4, so that we can reposition this guy. And yeah, I'll answer your question in a second. So let me just finish showing what happens after h3. So rook e8, g4, knight b6, threatening this guy, so simply b3. But we want to play b3 anyway. a5. Okay, so now black's going to want to play a4. So we're probably not going to want to castle queenside. But it's nice to have the option. But if black just kind of sits around and waits and does nothing, and we kind of roll our pawns on the king side, then maybe queenside castling would be actually preferable. So it's good to keep the options open, but here, now that black plays a5, we're going to want to castle kingside. So kingside castle, a4, ab, d5, c5. Now this knight has to retreat. Now again we get a knight to g3 and play g5 and play f4 and play knight f5 and play knight d6. And white is doing quite well here. This knight on d6 is a monster. This bishop on c8 is not so much of a monster. So this is a kind of a dream position for white. Okay, so let me go back to what you were saying real quick. So on move 7, d5, yeah. So the problem with this is d5, d5, queen d8, king d8. And no matter what you do, I play king c7, and my king is quite safe on c7 and closer to the center. You have no real threats on the king because this pawn on c6 stops any knights from trying to b5 or d5. So okay, you can play knight c3, I play, I don't know, bishop e6, you queenside castle, check, I play king c7, and I'm actually probably at least equal in this ending. Because I have more development. I'm going to play like knight bd7 next, rook d8. Play knight f3, I have knight g4. So, yeah, just because you forfeit black's right to castle doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. Yeah, this king is actually quite safe on c7. Okay, so that was the bishop b4 line, by the way. Okay, let's look at d6 now. Okay, so again, I'll make another note of what you said. So again, if take, queen d8, king d8, there's really no weaknesses in black's position. If black has played this move g6 with bishop g7, then maybe this becomes a little bit more of a possibility, because then the dark squares are even weaker. But here, really, there's no weaknesses. Yeah, so it's definitely better to maintain the tension. I mean, if you really love endgames, sure, but this endgame really doesn't offer any advantages for you. So which is why the move here is to play knight c3 instead. And this will kind of resemble the other lines in a bit. So knight c3, knight bd7. So again, we're playing e3 with this idea to play knight ge2, because we're going to want to play h3, g4, and knight g3. Okay, so bishop b7, castle, castle, rook e8. And again, you'll notice some of the same ideas. Queen c2. Queen a5, bishop b2, so we're putting pressure on this e5 pawn. Knight d4. So now that black has made this exchange, this move h3 and g4 doesn't make much sense, because now our knight's on d4. So queen h5. Trying to transfer to f4. Trying to trade queens. Says no. This queen is taking a lot of abuse. Look at it. Finally it goes away. But look how much time we've gained. Okay. Now do you guys see a very strong move for white here? Through some clever maneuvering, he's managed to get all his pieces into very good squares. Then if you look at black's development, it's relatively non-existent. This rook is dead, bishop's dead, queen's on its original square, rook's not really doing too much. This bishop's kind of just chilling. So our pieces are in their pretty much optimal positions, but they alone cannot win this game for us. So what do we have to do? We got to bring pawns in. So c5. So the point is just a simple deflection. Take an e5. And now after knight d5, e6, all of a sudden everything's opening up. So black plays this move, knight takes f4, which is a mistake, because after pawn takes, king takes, knight h6 check, black just resigned. He was getting shachmated into. So the king has no legal moves, so take is forced. Queen takes pawn check, bishop g7, only legal move, and mate. So, pretty nice game. Pretty good, but even if black hadn't blundered, white was still doing quite well in that position. Twitch didn't agree. Why not? I'm still streaming. Okay. So the other move here is e4, which is actually playable. So this is basically like a reversed French in a way. And white has an extra tempo, and also he can develop this bishop outside the pawn chain. Okay, so knight c3, d5, take, take, and now we get this bishop outside the pawn chain. Rook c1, so we don't have to take back with the pawn. Oh, sorry, knight h3. I don't know where I got queen b3 from. Oh, that was the next move, I see. Okay, so knight h3. So he wants to just go knight f4. Knight b7, queen b3, take, and rook takes. And white's doing quite well here. I believe you, Marius. Okay. So that's the Curie system. So now we'll just take a quick survey of some other second moves for black that are less common after e4 or after c4, e5, g3. So the moves we'll look at are going to be c6, g6, f5, d5, and d6. So some of these will actually end up transposing to other lines we've looked at, but a couple of things might be unique. Okay, so let's look at c6 first. So again, black wants to establish a center with d5, so we have to combat that with d4. Okay, now black can try four things again. You can play take, play bishop b4, play d6, or you can play e4. So similar to the Curie system, but except the moves bishop g2 and knight f6 have been omitted. So let's look at each of them individually. So ed4, queen b4, d5, cd5, cd5, bishop g2. Okay, so this basically forces a transposition to what we saw after knight f6, knight f3. Because this move, knight c6, is probably not good enough. Queen d5, bishop d5, knight b4 or d4, bishop e4, knight f6, bishop d3, and not enough for the pawn. Not enough for the pawn. Okay, so let's look at line 2. So this one kind of transposes by force. Okay, this one, bishop b4, again, bishop d2, take, and we're going to take with the queen, d6, knight c3. Knight f6 and bishop g2, again, this transposes into what we saw. But just a note that this looks tempting to play take, and this move queen g5, which like forks these two pawns. But the point is, after queen b6, we're threatening queen takes b2. And the point is, if say knight a4, you can play queen takes f2. This is tricky. The idea of king takes knight e4. Okay, so don't play that, basically, is the moral of the story. Okay, so now d6, again, this will probably transpose after knight c3, knight f6, bishop g2, knight bd7. And again, it transposes. Okay, so the fourth thing is e4. And now knight c3, d5, cd5, cd5. And now notice that since black hasn't played this move knight f6, we can't really develop our bishop to g5 so easily. So queen b3, knight e7, bishop f4. So now we're going to threaten knight b6. Now f3 to break up the pawn structure. And here, white has some good activity after rook d1, de4, d5, knight d5, rook d5, bishop d5, knight d5, bishop d6 to stop knight c7, queen takes b7, and castle is forced. So take, and now of course queen takes c6, knight e7 check, knight takes e6, e takes f3, and king f2, and white's better. Okay, let me go back to what Wish asked, which is what happens on... Oh, sorry. What happens on... Oh, bishop b4 check, right? So bishop b4 check, bishop d2, bishop d2, queen d2, okay, d6, knight c3, knight f6. Okay, so now if take, queen g5. Oh, sorry. I made a mistake. Sorry, I completely made a mistake. Sorry. Okay, yeah, you guys must think I'm crazy. Sorry. So the actual line is actually this. It's castle to defend this guy. Queen takes e5, queen b6. Sorry. So the point is you're threatening both queen takes b2 and queen takes f2. Sorry. No, you're right. Okay. So does that make more sense now? Yeah, I was looking at it myself. I was like, what the heck am I talking about? Okay. So yeah, so now the point is if you play like a move like b3 or something, I can play queen takes f2 here. Okay. And now king takes f2, knight g4. Yeah, sorry. No, you're absolutely right. Okay. So that's tough to meet. Okay, so by the way, knight d1 is forced here. So you have to play knight d1 to defend against both threats. And now rook e8, and black has a good position. Because white really only has one piece developed. And black can start developing all his pieces quickly. So this is probably a bad pawn sack for white to accept. Okay. So yeah, you guys are absolutely right. Okay, so now let's look at 2g6, which probably will transpose, but maybe not. So bishop g2, bishop g7, knight c3. So if knight c6, of course, we go e4, transposition to the Botvinnik. If d6, again, we're going to go transpose it to the Botvinnik. Try to. So if knight f6, after d3, we transpose into something that we'll see in a little bit later. But if black plays a move like c6, for example, d3, bishop b6, knight g2, queen c8, just develop normally. And then if bishop h3, now we can actually take this. Play queen b3 to hit b7, force the queen to retreat, and now d4. So now that black's not stopped d4, we can play it ourselves. And notice the dark square control that we have here. Yeah, and this is just real good for white. Okay. So g6 will usually transpose, but if black tries to play something like this, this is just real good for white. Okay, so now let's look at f5. Okay, so if knight c6 here, then knight c3, knight f6 transposes. But if knight f6 here, we have an additional opportunity, which is to play this move d4 right away. So again, if d4 is ever possible quickly, in general you want to try to get it in, because black is often not completely prepared to meet it. Okay, so black has a bunch of choices here. He can take, he can push, he can give a check, or he can just defend it. Okay, so take, gain of tempo on the queen, but now queen e3. Looks like a very strange move. But the point is that this kind of crosses black up a bit. So no matter how black blocks, he's kind of shutting in one of his pieces. So if queen e7, for example, knight c3, take. So white's better structurally here. this f5 is a bit more of a target than the c4 pawn is. And white will have probably more chances on the d file than black will have on the e file, and the c pawn on c7 is a target potentially after a move like knight b5. And actually black can also play a move like king f7 here. But again, after knight f3, check, bishop e2, rook e8, and just knight c3 again. Black has some issues. This king is not completely safe. And the c7 pawn will also become a target if this queen ever moves from its original square. Okay, so the main move here is bishop e7. Okay, hold on one second. Let me just shut off ICC. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so bishop e7, again, knight c3, castle. Okay, so now we want to get our knights to d5. So again, this knight h3, f4, d5 idea is going to come into play. So it's more accurate than to play knight f3. So b6, castle, so we want to try to shut out this guy from the game. Normally you could play like bishop b2 first, knight f4, rook a d1, but here you want to kind of shut out this guy immediately. So after takes, c takes, bishop e2, and here white has a good position. His bishops are kind of raking the board, crisscross style. And this pawn on d5 is actually hemming in his pieces. And white's going to play e4 soon. He's going to play like rook fe1 and e4 soon to further harass black's queen. Okay, so if black pushes through, knight c3, and now black's trying to construct a big clamp on the center with d5. So we hit the e pawn immediately. And now bishop b4, queen b3, c5. Okay, castle. C takes. Now, what should white recapture with? Paradoxically, it's actually the knight. So this looks supremely anti-positional, but white's pieces get a ton of activity. And actually, as you'll see, black's eventually forced to exchange and let this happen anyway. So after knight c6, rook hf1, black actually decides to take anyway. And then we fix our pawn structure. But now notice the difference in the bishops is quite drastic. So rook b8, bishop d5, king h8, and now e4. Or sorry, g4, g4, and then e4. So g4 take and then e4. This is quite nasty. Quite nasty. Okay. So bishop b4, again we block. Again we take. And again, knight e2, and white, you know, is slightly better, Similar, some of the similar ideas. White has option of castling on either side. This h3 g4 obviously won't be as much of an idea, but it should be the case that white can use the deep file to greater effect than black can. So okay, now finally d6. Okay, now we're gonna basically force e4 here. And now simply just bishop g5, knight f4, and queen b3. Just trying to attack this pawn as many times as possible. So if black tries to stop it with h6, then knight f4. Notice that this g6 square becomes open. So after knight g6, rook g8, castle, this is tough for black, because this knight's a monster, and it's going to come back into play on e5 or f4 again. So instead, if knight c6, okay, now we play our plan. This looks good for white. This bishop's going to come into effect on h3. The queen's going to come into h5. This king is not too safe. Okay, so let's look at the last couple of moves, which are if black plays immediate d5, which isn't actually terribly silly. Take knight f3, and the point is to play bishop b4. And so the point is after knight c3, he wants to take and play e4. So a3, e4, ab4, ef3. Now this move, rook a5, looks odd, but it actually is quite effective. And now b5, stopping knight from coming to a6 or c6 and threatening rook a4. So queen h5. Whoops. Not rook a6. But take on a7. And white's up 2 pawns here. And I don't see what black has. So this has got to be pretty good for white. Okay, so knowing that a3 idea with rook a5 is kind of cute. Okay, so if d6, happy to try to go into a Botvinnik. So if f5, for example, d4 right away. Knight c6, de5. If knight e5, we have the same idea of knight h3 to f4, because he can't take on c4 because of queen a4 check. So that pawn is kind of defended indirectly. So if de5, then we take on c6, take on d8, and play knight f3. And after e4, knight e5, fork and fork, so king e8 forced, and we just won a pawn. So that bishop takes c6 was an important Zwischenzug. And now I just want a pawn. So instead, knight c6, then we just develop the normal way, Botvinnik style. So if knight ge2, it allows bishop h3. And it might be a little dangerous. So we want to do as much as we can before we have to play knight e2. Okay, and now if black castles queenside on move 7, now we have our own thing we can do. We can play knight d5 and start playing b4, b5, and queen a4, and this is very dangerous for black. So he has to exercise caution as well. So bishop g7 instead, more traditional. And again, we want to delay it for as long as possible. Queen d2. So black tries to play knight g4 here, we just ignore it. Now this move actually is not good because of after take, knight e2, c5, we have this move b4. Castle, take, and now notice that after we play f4, look, these pawns are mobile. There's no d6 pawn anymore, so now e5 is going to happen in the very near future. So after rook f8, rook c1, bishop d7, e5, knight h5, knight f3, and f6. Now he just sacrifices a piece for some compensation, but it's not enough because we can simply castle. And black doesn't have nearly enough for his piece here. And white went on to win. Okay, so that covers pretty much all of 1 c4 e5. The next big chunk to cover is what happens when black responds to c4 with c5.